Hello everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for coming. This is Tempest Gallery, run by Daphne Tudis and Chris Baker. This exhibition is called Cat's Cradle, and we have three fantastic artists to my right who are going to briefly introduce themselves and the works that they have in the show.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. And my name is 𝘾𝙖𝙞𝙩 𝙍𝙚𝙞𝙙. I'm from Tehran, and I've been based in Brooklyn since 2019. And that's it, right?
And
my piece is called The Landscape of My Voice, East River. And should I explain more now or later?
We'll come. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Also thank you for being here. My name is Claire. I am a weaver and textile artist, originally from Georgia, but have been in the city for around 4 to 5 years. My piece is kind of tucked in the corner over there. I like to kind of create these like modular installation structures in my work.
I'm Catherine Earle. The rest of the work is mine, actually, in this show. And I am a weaver, textile artist, and sort of like thinking sculpturally, but haven't quite entered the sculptural realm yet too much. And I did my BFA in Montreal, and then have been living in New York for just over a decade.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. And so one of the themes of this show is the interaction between poetry, language, and form. So Layla's going to begin with a poem titled East River.
Sure. First I'm going to read it in Persian, then I'm going to read the translation of it in English. رود شرقی آفتاب از آنجا که تو شروع می‌شوی طلوع می‌کند، تو جاری می‌شوی، جدا می‌کنی هر دو طرف را. پل‌ها وصل می‌کنند مرزهای تو را، کشتی‌ها امواج تو را واژگون می‌کنند، به اقیانوس اطلس شمالی می‌ریزی، چندین روز بعد در آن دورها به خانه می‌رسی، آنجا که رودها بر بستر تنهایی خیش می‌گریند، از کوه‌های البرز سرازیر می‌شوی، به تهران که می‌رسی می‌باری. مادرم در کنار پنجره به تماشای باران نشسته. ای کاش در تو جاری می شدم. آه ای رود شرقی. East River, the sun rises where you emerge. Flowing down, you divide both sides. Bridges connecting your banks, ships overturn your waves. You pour into the North Atlantic Ocean. Several days later, in the faraway land, you arrive home, where the rivers weep on their bed of loneliness. You flow through the Elborz mountains. When you reach Tehran, you rain. My mother is sitting by the window, gazing out at the rain. I wish I were flowing in you, oh, the Eastern River.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. Could you actually begin by talking a bit about how poetry entered your artistic practice?
Mm-hmm. Well, it started with my migration journey. I was not doing it while I was in Tehran, and I feel like that became like a refuge for me to express my emotions, facing with a lot of challenges, cultural differences, or even like the duality between talking and thinking between Persian, English, and Turkish. It's quite challenging, and like unconsciously I feel like it opened up its way to express those in the literature.
Yeah, and you've mentioned also that Persian has such a literary tradition. It has unique capacity to evoke meaning.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Well, Persian is a poetic language, and it carries, like a lot of metaphor and a lot of like surreal or unrealistic or imaginary moments, and it carries all the way to like everyday life. It's not separated. So when I started to speak in English 24/7, it looked very mechanical for me and very straightforward and sometimes shocking. And then trying to translate the poem to English, it is still also a struggle. It's so hard to find the same weight and some like lightness or those back and forces that is basically exist in Persian language to transfer it and find some capacity of it in English. So I feel like that became like a performance for me to bring the audience in a moment that they hear something, and then when they listen to the English version of it, I'm always curious to know that how much the English speaker audience is, you know, interacting or understanding. Of course, it's not going to be equal. I don't mean like any of the versions in Persian or English is better or worse. It's just a matter of how it's impossible to translate exact from one language to the other, and it reflects my personal life as an immigrant from Tehran to New York, that how it's impossible for me to, you know, like have the moments that I can have in home because there's no ground for it. So I found this way of expressing it somehow interesting and more sort of like the way that I wanted to. So I feel like the audience can experience it a lot more in this way. So, yeah.
Wonderful. And I think that we'll touch again on the connection between poetry and your piece and how they kind of have a comparable materiality.
Mm-hmm.
So I also, so kind of following that thread, I wanted to ask, what are the, let's just start by saying, like, what are the research components in everyone's work? Like, what is the kind of like conceptual basis under which inspires, you know, creating these wonderful works? Do you want to start, Claire?
Yeah, I personally look at a lot of craft techniques that are kind of close to my sphere. A lot of the weaving drafts that I take are overshot drafts, which is very regional to the Appalachian United States. And then I'm also thinking a lot about piecing and patching and this more like familial practice that my mother has told me about, that her grandmother used to do it for her, but I've never really seen in real life. So bridging those two things have been really important for me in my own work. But I also do a lot of research on, or have a really large interest in Chinese immigration to Georgia specifically. I think it's super fascinating in the ways that it is so different than what we see in like New York or LA, and how much of it is shaped by things like the US military and religion, and how these things kind of play into how people move from place to place.
Wonderful. And what are kind of like the source materials? Like you had mentioned newspapers, or like what is those actual, the sources.
The stuff.
Yeah.
I use a lot of digitized newspapers from around Atlanta or Macon, Georgia, from like the early 1900s to like the late 1990s. It's interesting to see how narrative is built through these, and the importance that these things do have, because they do create like they are digital. They like are like the remnants, the archive of like of all of this movement. And then on the other hand, I use a lot of personal photos that my grandparents took in like the 2000s. It's like one of the only like things that I have from them. And it's just them like doing normal stuff like grocery shopping or like watering plants around Atlanta. Yeah.
Fabulous.
So the question is like research that drives the work. Okay. I think that my practice is really a response. It's like a responsive practice. So I'm always sort of, I feel like in our lives we're not really given a lot of space to respond to what's being like projected onto us. And it's like a way to kind of push back against that a lot. In thinking through this show, I was really reading Félix Guattari's 3 Ecologies, which is talking about the way in which sort of the collapse of ecosystems and the collapse and like disappearance of ideas are sort of happening simultaneously. Like capitalism is like confining us to certain ways of thinking and even frameworks to think within and existence, and then like we're also seeing a disappearance of biodiversity and ecosystem. And he's like talking about those as happening simultaneously, and like the loss of idea is also the loss of our world. And I think that's a really interesting concept.
What is the loss of idea? Like the loss of like a narrative, like a grand narrative?
Yeah, narrative stories, like histories, right, which we're
yes,
seeing in real time happening now. Like you see that in history, like, you know, archives get destroyed, museums get destroyed, like the ability to even just tell your own story is, you know, colonization really across the world really like usurped that from many people. And I think for me, a lot of what I am doing in my practice, which is like maybe a little abstract, but feels to me very, very real, is that I feel as though I use my practice to kind of like uproot and unearth the paradigms within which I like learned that are harmful. And so I think that a lot of the times it's our unconsciousness that is the cause of harm. And it's like if we're not bringing consciousness to our existence and how we're even just sort of being in the world and what we're thinking about, that Donna Haraway that you shared, like there was a quote in there from I think Marilyn Strathern, and she was saying like it matters what ideas we think our ideas with, right? And I feel like I'm constantly trying to like unpack and deconstruct and unravel and undo like a lot of what I was taught. I grew up in New Hampshire, very homogenous place, very like public school. You know, there's just a lot that I was taught that I don't believe, and I don't know that. Anyway, but back to the work. Like I feel like sometimes I get pulled away from the work. I mean, weaving is also this way. For me, it's like a communicative structure, and it allows for me to kind of speak in a way that language doesn't allow, and so, yeah.
Fabulous, wonderful. That is so fascinating. I'm also in thinking about this show from a curatorial perspective. One thing that stands out to me is that there are so many. Of course, we have these lovely wall pieces, but a majority of the works are installation. They're fiber installation, which is in some sense combining like an ancient technique like weaving and a very contemporary approach, installation. So I was wondering if folks could describe what are like the unique capacities of this hybrid technology, and what do you feel like you're able to express perhaps in the works that you've shown here or in generally?
I should start first with this, that I studied painting both in Tehran and also here. But I use this medium with various reasons. One is that when I am starting to create something, I'm exactly thinking about it as a drawing or a painting. So it's not separate than what I do as a painter, and I will explain it more why I'm thinking like that. And I think this material actually came to my practice super organically. I grew up in a house that my mom is a housewife, and she has a lot of skills, and of course similar to a lot of other moms, she never gave herself any credit, and she was thinking like, oh, I'm not doing any specific thing. So actually I grew up by seeing my mom doing the upcycling. For example, one of the examples is she dyes, like for example, let's say we have a curtain, and because of the sun it turned into some like, it got some yellow hue on it. So she was like dyeing it with some indigo pigment. So it was like soaking that yellowness out, and it was turning it more towards to the white. So it's exactly what a painter knows. So actually I grew up by seeing those things. Or like I had a jean and I was tired of it. So she was like dyeing it and turning it into another color. So it was turning into a new jean, and here you go, you can wear it. There's nothing wrong with it. So I saw that, or I saw like whenever she was like sewing something, she was also like with the leftovers, she was like sewing, I don't know, a skirt or a dress for me. So that was like literally my natural habitat. And I wasn't even knowing in the beginning that, oh, what I'm going to choose as an alternative material, because I was so curious to experience something out of like canvas and paint. And it became like naturally my first try. And it was again my mom there telling me how to dye, how to sew. And the first series of my installation actually was made in our backyard in Tehran with the help of my mom.
Wow.
We dyed the fabric together and hung it and let it dry. And then when I was experiencing to see those draping forms and stuff like that, of course my mom was there, and of course like the methods that she was using to hang the laundry and let it dry with like large pieces, let's say the curtain, it was my job to go to the rooftop and hang it and let it dry, and then again I had to go and take it back. So I was like seeing those drapings and the forms and how the rope is holding a lot of weight, and also the magic of folding the fabric pieces. And it became actually a great opportunity for me because I could fold my fabrics and put it in a suitcase and bring it all the way from Tehran to New Haven. So it traveled with me above the ocean, and this capacity of this material became like very, you know, so like it became like a core with my life as an immigrant, because I can fold and put a piece in a small carry-on and take it somewhere and open it and install it, and it occupies the entire space. Then I can easily deinstall it and fold it back and take it back. So like literally like a nomad lifestyle. It can travel easily, it can open up, and it can turn into a very small piece and get back. So it became even like more interesting for me to push it further when I emigrated to the US. So and of course, little by staying more and more, my collection became more from New York, but still my fabric collection is something in between Tehran, like it's a collection from Tehran and New York. And again, my mom has a role in it because she sometimes sends fabric for me. So her taste is still there. Or my first critic is my mom, because whenever I make something, I'm like, what do you think, Mom? Like, and she starts to like give some thoughts mostly about like aesthetic or the technique. You need to sew this part, or you do this. So I really love it. So she's always with me, and it's so interesting that I can keep going with this tradition of something that mothers were teaching to their daughters as a housewife techniques and skills. And my mom was constantly telling me like, you don't need these things, you need to study, you're not gonna use this. But then I feel like I became able like to go to the academy and learn painting, and also by learning those skills from my mom, I could find a contemporary language of using these together and recreating with a, you know, like a new language. So yeah, so that's how like my practice as a painter, you know, kind of like got like some transformation. But still in my mind, I think about it as a painting and drawing, like I'm not separating it.
I mean, I feel like I'm building the collection of influences, like language, drawing, into painting. I mean, these are so gestural, and I'm also deeply taken with this idea that it can transform and accompany you. So it's easily transportive.
Exactly.
And that feels like it's part of the work that I wouldn't have known unless you described it in that way. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
Ooh, installation.
Oh yeah, cute little topic. Small topic.
A small topic.
A small topic.
Easy topic to talk about.
Ah, yes.
I think I was really interested personally in thinking about how these weavings can work as monuments. I think it happened at a time when monuments were really being talked about in the South, of whether or not do we tear them down, do we keep them, how do we reframe them, how do we contextualize them. And this this growing development of this like one highway system around Metro Atlanta area that I remember going to as a child, but has now, Atlanta has grown, there's so much more money, so a lot of that is either being completely redeveloped or it's just all apartment buildings. So it was, I found myself just like having this need to monumentalize just like the things that I remember or like the more mundane things. But also trying to also, I guess, like copy a lot of like the tarps and like the growing construction sites, these empty storefronts that I was also seeing at the same time. So then they grew into these installation things, and now I'm definitely a little bit more interested in space and how they have a relationship with space. How do they move the body around? And then what can and then similarly, like the modularity and how easily removable these pieces are, how I can take them with me, and then how they can kind of morph and modify within different spaces.
Yeah, Chris was telling me that you have these snaps attached to the straps and you can create like a different configuration.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's like the strap system is all snaps. So I can change the height if I want to. I can make them larger or wider. They can snap to each other. So there's this like sense of, there's always like change that can happen within it.
Would you say that, I mean, your work is so grounded in place, is it also connected to architecture?
I'm really interested in architecture. And
I couldn't even say why that strikes me, but I'm curious.
Yeah, well, it's so funny. I was like looking at the work of Gordon Matta Clark, who I didn't know previously, but the way that he is like really working with this space of like a whole building is something that I'm really interested in. And how that can also be a way to invite viewers to also like play. And I think like this idea of play is something very new, but something that I think it would be interesting if someone felt like the need to like unsnap something or move something, and like how do you create that impetus, or like how do you create that action? Yeah.
It's interesting because fiber is already such a tactile, like you live with it with your body, you have it. So I wouldn't be surprised, although we do have enough self-control not to touch the art or try to, but I totally understand that impetus.
I want to ask, can I ask Clara a really quick question? Like, because there's also this, when you're talking about being able to recreate the straps in these different ways, like, and is there also, it's made me think about memory and like the sort of like inconsistencies of memory and how it can be like constructed and deconstructed and reconstructed.
Right.
And
that's so interesting because when I was doing this installation, Chris and Daphne probably know, I was like looking at my phone and like trying to remember, wait, was this here or do I place this here? How do but it doesn't have to be the previous variation of what it was. Everything is always a new variation.
Yeah.
But it's interesting also thinking about just like the physical memory that we have for things and like how does this place or what was it like when I like walked down this road or I went to this new place, and like how can that also embody the artwork, the work as well?
that's very, yeah. It's interesting, like memory as place also. Installation, okay.
Installation.
So this is quite new for me to be able to install as an installation, so it's very exciting. I've been wanting to like move my work off the wall for a long time. And you know, I studied textile, I studied fiber arts. I graduated in 2011. Textiles is like having its like heyday right now. Everybody thinks like fiber arts is so awesome and all these painters are using it and it's really wonderful. Like I didn't have, so like 15 years ago, that really wasn't so much the case. And so I spent a lot of time, I actually moved away from floor weaving and into tapestry weaving because I felt like people could respond to it as art a little bit more. And it's not that I regret that, but I'm not like a tapestry weaver. Like I want my floor loom back. Like these are made on a table loom, and like I just spent so much time being like, oh, people would be like, oh, that's a nice table runner. Oh, that's a nice, like it was just like domestic. It was just domestic. It was just like you would tell people, you know, even now it's like you tell most people you're a textile artist, they're like, oh yeah, I crochet, like, which is wonderful. Like that's part of what I love about it. It's an accessibility thing, but it's also how do you, like now and I've always been quite I don't know what the word is, but this distinction between fine art and craft I've always pushed against, because I do believe that craft is, I believe that that's actually very colonial, and it was imposed, and it has a lot of negative implications. So it is very exciting to be able to take the weaving and take these textiles and take up space with them in that new way. And I do, when I first went to university, I didn't go to art school, and it was like in a liberal arts school. I was studying architectural studies. I really loved like the way in which our bodies respond, right? And our whole experience is impacted by, the space that we're in and everything that happens within that. So yeah, new frontier and very exciting one. Yeah.
Wonderful. Can you speak to this particular arrangement, because it's a semicircle, and you are almost enveloped by it in your present arrangement. And I'm just curious, like, what is it that you kind of intend? I mean, what I see in it is like it's protective, it's permeable. Mm-hmm. You can see both sides. You can walk around it, but it's almost like something that could protect you, or a structure in some way. So, like, could you speak to this particular arrangement?
Yeah, I think we kind of came up with this as we installed it. We weren't really sure how these were going to be installed, and this sort of came to be. It was the right development of the installation. But it does, being inside of it right now, like, it does feel very much like it can hold, and I think that's what's really interesting for me, is like the ability to hold space ourselves. Like there's something in that feels very prescient and interesting. I'd like to continue with this series and make it make more of them, and make it more of an experiential walk through. And I think that there is, for me, I don't know the answer to that, but the impermeability of it, or like the permeability of it feels very important too. Like I like that when there's like a distinction or a barrier, but it's also not a barrier and not like there, you can kind of move through it, but I don't know why. So
lovely. And now I want to ask a few individual materials questions. So Claire, I know that you've mentioned you've sourced like the archive, these photographic materials. Could you speak more to your process of printing and how that plays a role in weaving?
Yes. I have a lot of trial and error for printing, but I feel very lucky that now I have the space to be able to kind of really take up a lot of space in the process. But this is an image actually of my grandfather making dumplings.
Wow.
Also, I'm also remembering that I think this was the only time that I have had these dumplings in my life. So now I'm feeling a little sad about it. But I take the image, I burn them onto screens, and they're mostly printed as panels. So I print the warp first before I even start weaving it. I let it dry, I roll it back, and then I weave the weft in. For this process, there actually isn't a lot of weft woven in, so it's in my hope that you can actually see the image a little clearer. But it is a double weave, so the back is this like textural overshot that you get, and it's really nice being able to work with those two different sides. I think it helps create like this like motion, the circular motion, a little bit better in the work. But printing is great. I think it does act a lot like a memory. It's always not as saturated. The image is never as saturated than when you print it the first time. And I kind of like to work in this like repetitive way in which they almost become like film stills, or like strips of film in a sense.
Oh wow, now that you say that, I can totally see the ribbons in that connection. Yeah, and you said you silk screen, and like what's the dye process like?
The dye is a combination of silk painting dye and like this fluid made from urea that makes it a little bit thicker. If you print it with just like a plastic screen print dye, like you have problems of just like warp ends sticking together. They don't want to like form a shed. So it's really important that whatever dye you use is like watery enough to where that doesn't happen, but also like thick enough to where the image holds. If anyone wants the recipe, I am always happy to share because it took me kind of a long time to figure out. But
Wonderful. And speaking of dye, Layla, you have this like glorious indigo color. So I was wondering if you could speak more to how you achieve these kinds of hues. And additionally, could you talk more about, you mentioned you use saffron, acidic dyes, pre-washes with the fabric. Like, could you walk us through some of that process?
Sure. Well, I think about pigment again like a painter using the paint itself. So for these pieces specifically, because the fabric is sheer, so it's much easier actually to get this sort of blue. So whenever I want to use the pigment, I think about it that, oh, I can mix it just a tiny bit of it. I don't have to mix like the whole spoon, or maybe I want to like use 2 spoons, you know, like I play with the pigment exactly like a painter, let's say like painting with watercolor. And also the material of the fabric itself, that is it going to turn it into like an opaque color, or is it going to turn it into like a shiny color? Again, for this one, because it's sheer, it was exactly the perfect color that I was thinking. It's exactly like the reason that I used like a sheer fabric rather than just like a regular cotton fabric, to be able to get this color out of it. And for the saffron, I mean, my mom wasn't happy about it because it's extremely expensive. And of course, nothing can stop my curiosity. And like, I did a research about the history of dye in Iran, and it was interesting to notice that indigo was very popular, and it was like imported from India, so it was like a very common pigment. And then we apparently were using saffron and also the peel of pomegranate. And of course, like saffron was not very common, and it was mostly like for probably the royal family on silk. But because I was thinking about an abstract image of the East River, and I wanted to have something fluid, fragile, suspended, like light. So I was thinking about what if I try indigo and saffron. And actually it turned really good. I didn't even fix it. I didn't even know how to fix the saffron, but it's there. It hasn't faded or anything. It was completely experimental, but it worked. And I just feel like, again, it's really, let's say like a painter wants to make a sculpture, something like that. It's the process in my mind is like that. Even like the basic of this work, I started with a drawing of my idea, then dyeing it, and then thinking about like, oh, how am I gonna install it similar to the drawing of the idea that I have.
Lovely. And so these sections that are like lighter, warmer, that's the saffron?
Yes, yes. And also here, you can see it like, here. Yeah.
Wow, so very...
It's like an abstract painting, exactly.
Yeah, in 3 dimensions.
Yeah, exactly. 3D painting.
Wow. That's so fascinating. I'm curious also, is there something specific about using natural dyes? Or like, what was the impetus? That's what I'm hearing. It's like natural dye might be better than plastic in some ways.
That's one point, of course, that I would love to, similar to what she said, to use like natural pigments. Of course, I'm keeping the upcycling in my practice as well. But then also there is a long history of it in Iran, like especially on the Persian carpets. is the great example. Like all those dyes are coming from natural pigments, or like let's say like Persian miniatures. So the artists were making, you know, like with natural pigments, they were making something like watercolor or gouache, and then they were like creating those paintings. So it has such a long history behind of it, and it became like really interesting for me to include it. And also, just for your information, I'm still using the pigments that I brought from Tehran. And just like one day, the first time that I wanted to try and dye, my mom and I, we went to the downtown of Tehran, and there is an old bazaar. There are multiple like sections. One spot they're selling fabric, one spot they're selling pigments. So I got my pigments from there. And because like in reality, you're just using a tiny bit of the pigment. You don't need a lot of it. So it stays forever sort of thing. So I've been still using that. It's like interesting that even through the time, it's been like, let's say since 2017, it's been like 7 years and nothing happened to those pigments. And I feel like
that's incredible.
Yeah, and that's why, like, let's say like in the carpets, like they exist for like hundreds of years, centuries exactly, and the color is still there because it shows the quality of the pigment and of course the method of dye. So yeah, it became like really interesting to keep that tradition and experiment with it. Yeah.
So fascinating.
Thank you.
And so I have to, and sort of kind of going with this this thought about like natural versus man-made. Catherine, you have sourced so many found materials from the environment, upcycling trash. Could you speak to about like what types of things that you explicitly pick up, or speak to objects that you've embedded? I know here there's some things that I can make out and like have like an image in my mind. So I'm just curious if you could speak to that process.
Sure, and I think that I'm going to back up a little bit and just say that I don't really see a distinction between man-made and natural. It feels to me like a very, like the way that I understand it, but it, you know, we're of the earth. Everything that man makes, quote unquote, woman makes is of the earth. There's nothing unnatural about anything that's made by man. So that's sort of like how I'm approaching there's the plastic bag weavings, which I call my plastic paintings, which is a response to like fiber arts and not being given the same, you know, kind of attention as painting, perhaps, but also because I think that the plastics themselves create like really wonderful abstract, you know, they have a lot of abstract presence. And then the trash weavings are specifically, these ones are from specific locations. So in the city, so during the pandemic, I was walking a lot, and I would just see a pile of trash. I'd be like, oh, that doesn't look like a nice pile of trash. And I would gather it with my plastic bags, with my like, you know, I would carry on gloves and gather it and take it home, take it to the studio and bleach it, and then cut it and work with it. So these are sort of they're location based. One of my favorites, actually, I don't have anymore, but it was at Marcus Garvey Park. But it's like, you know, this is a cigarette package, can't like ice cream wrappers, string, spoon, straw, the kind of things that you see, and. You know, I think that I struggle with the plastic bag weavings came about because I was just like, what do I do with all of these plastic bags? Like, I'm so, like, you know, I have a whole series that was the result of reading about a whale that was washed ashore, and they did an autopsy, and the whale, you know, had ingested 80 bags. And so I just like I just don't feel good about throwing bags out, because I just don't know where they're going to end up. Like, this whole concept of garbage, of waste, to me is like problematic, right? Like, we live in a world where like everything, it like everything, there's no such thing as like throwing it away. Like even if it goes into space or whatever, like it's still within our world. Like we're still existing with it. Mm-hmm. So so this felt, yeah, like I just started to. Daphne actually taught me how to cut them, or showed me a video on how to cut them, the bags, and I was like, oh, and I started weaving them, and I just really liked what they did.
It feels to me almost like a material metaphor. You're able to almost reclaim something and embed it with such tenderness and care that you're like revitalizing it in your own in your own way.
Yeah, there's a book, I think it's Jane Bennett, it's called Vibrant Matter, and she like talks about like what matter that is not, sorry, I'm not thinking of the right word, but like not like basically that matter has consciousness, right? Is like sort of how I interpret that. And so I do, like when I do really think that, you know, especially plastics, I mean, we're gonna be known by future societies as like trash. Like we're just like, our plastics are gonna be here for, you know, for a very long time. And yeah, and they're embedded within our bodies, they're embedded within like the clouds and the rain, they're embedded in our oceans, they're embedded in our food, they're embedded in everything that they're like just, plastic is just such a presence, it has such a presence in our lives. It's also like, you know, the politics of it being a result of the petrochemical industry and sort of how it was pushed on us, and single-use plastics was like, you know, it was an advertising campaign that we all like bought hook, line, and sinker, and so there's a lot there. But I do, yes, like I do feel like using, like pulling this stuff off the street and being like, I see you, you know, I see you, and I wanna recognize you, and I wanna think, you know, like this sort of idea of material. Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought.
Material
like,
metaphor.
Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Fabulous. Okay, so we're going to ask the panel one last question, and then we're going to read a poem, and then we're going to pause for questions. So our final question is: who are your artistic ancestors? Oh, yeah, cute little small question for the last one.
Okay. Well, I'm coming from a family that no one is an artist, so at least as far as I know, from both sides, no one is used to be artists or anything. But I feel like in my mom's side, these skills of like making, doing embroideries or sewing and stuffs like that, like with my mom or my grandparents. It came all the way from there, and I feel like maybe that's the reason I became interested to use sort of like some techniques that is coming from domestic environment or close to craft. And I understand that sometimes people criticize that, but I'm sort of like I'm not accepting that, because I feel like using like domestic material or craft doesn't mean that is going to lower the value of the art making practice. But it's really hard to give an answer. Maybe I can say my ancestors, like it's my mom again, and the nature, I would say. Like I grew up with the mountains in Tehran, and unconsciously it became a refuge for me to do observational drawings. I was very insist of having observational drawings, and it was challenging, and I feel like unconsciously I found myself more and more next to the mountains in Tehran, and I had a series of drawings with charcoal and pastel, and it taught me a lot of things, just like naturally. We're just being there and absorbing it, and it's still with me even though I'm not there anymore. I don't know, am I absent there, or is the mountains absent here with me? So I have such a deep connection with the metaphor of mountain, I would say.
I love that answer. My artistic ancestors are the actual mountains.
I would have to say, of course, like all of the like anonymous weaver, like women weavers, and also all of the anonymous women who are making these like quilted patches in China that I draw from. I think it's like sometimes you only know like their family name or where they grew up, but it's important because it's like this is where I draw my inspiration from. It's important for me to also like be grateful for them for creating this world for me to live in. But I was kind of the same. I didn't really grow up from like a very artistic family, but I was going through these old photos and I found these like series of tablescapes that my dad took back in China, and it was just so strange because they basically function as like these strange still lives. But the way that he was like working with light, or the way that he saw light and placement, is kind of like the way that I also see light and placement, and that was just like a funny, interesting connection for me personally.
What is a tablescape?
It's like the table of my grandparents. They would have like a vase with flowers and then oranges, but they would change in the ways that like he wasn't just taking these on one day, but he was taking how this table changes multiple days or through like a span of time. And I think for me, it's like maybe one way for him to like remember these like more mundane things, but I just thought they were just so beautiful in themselves as just like photographs of like time passing.
Gorgeous. Catherine?
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely like a question that it's a hard one, right? I think there's just so many people that I'm grateful to that have influenced me, and I think, you know, just hearing Layla, you speak about your mother and her impact on your practice. Like my mom, growing up, she was an amateur weaver and she had a loom in the home, and I do think that has always been a place of connection for me. With her is weaving almost like unconscious. Like at some point I was like, oh right, like she was a weaver because I lost her when I was young, and so I think that I think that she sort of had a lot that she didn't get to see through in her life, and I often feel like my birthday is right after hers. Like there's like this continuation that I feel like I embody, that I'm grateful to be able to embody. And I think that, you know, one of the artists, the living artists right now who I'm really grateful for is 𝘾𝙖𝙞𝙩 𝙍𝙚, and like the way that she thinks about co-creation, and just like listening to her talk about her practice always feels like a real gift. But similarly, like every artisan that has created anything ever, like they're my debts are to them, like to all of these people that came before us and that exist with us currently now.
Beautiful. Wonderful. So we're going to close out with a poem written and read by Layla.
Again, I'm going to read it first in Persian, then the translation in English. گل‌های سرخ یخ‌زده، گل‌های سرخ یخ‌زده در همسایگی من در تلاشند برای یک لحظه زندگی، زیرا آفتاب کمرمق پاییزی. سرخیشان رنگ باخته، میدانم محال است، اما خیال میکنم. Frozen red roses. Frozen red roses in my neighborhood struggle for a moment of life beneath the pale autumn sun. Their redness has faded. I know it's impossible, yet I imagine.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's joined us for this fabulous talk on a Saturday. We are open to take questions, so if you have anything you'd like to ask the artists, they're here. Oh, okay. So, and if you have a question, I'm going to give you my mic.
Okay.
So the recording
Just to up the pressure.
Hello. I think my first question will go to Catherine because your piece is just in front of me. I wondered if you could explain more and talk about the bodily relationship between your work and your experience of weaving and making them. And also, I'm very curious about the transparency and opacity that you chose in the material, because I kept staring at the section as a viewfinder.
That's a viewfinder.
Yeah, and I'm wondering whether the other parts where I can slightly see through and I'm blocked by the material is something you're kind of thinking in a rhythm way, or if there's other logic within the choice of which part does the blocking and which part does the seeing through. Yeah, I think I'll just stop there for now.
Yeah, so sorry, the first is like the physicality, like the bodily experience of weaving. Is that the question? Yeah, which is really interesting because I've made work where I've actually like printed my body on the weaving, because like weaving is labor, right? There's like this labor component. These are all woven on a table loom, so I stand up and like it's a practice where I'm standing and I'm weaving. But weaving is very physical. Like I want to get my larger table loom back, and then I would sit, and you know it's a wider shaft, so you get to throw back and forth. It's like it is a very rhythmic experience. I don't have any tapestry. Well, this piece was woven on a tapestry loom, the Let This Illusion Fall, with the beads, and that is I'm seated when I'm weaving that piece. Does that answer that physical question, or was that, yeah?
Well, I also thought about the width.
The width.
Is this just a little,
Got you.
Sorry. It's just a little shorter than my shoulder, so when I stand in front of it, I became really aware of my relationship, you know, the body with this thing that implies the body.
Yeah, so I mean that is like the restriction of the table loom that I have. Like that's as wide as it goes. So I'm sort of like pushing it to its width. But I do actually really like the panels. You know, they make me think of like kilim looms that are woven in panels. And I think because this is sort of the first time that it's been in an installation, this component of the body, it is apparent suddenly, right? Like you're saying, like it's sort of the width of a shoulder, you know, for certain people's shoulders or that kind of thing. So it's something, yeah, it's a really interesting question. And then with regards to I mean, I think I spoke to sort of like almost the question that I have about my interest in this, like opacity versus transparency, and you know, it feels like maybe like a little bit liminal, but also kind of thinking about the ways in which I mean, I don't even want to say just like with each other, because it's also like with ourselves, like we only like kind of see like elements of ourselves sometimes. Like there's certain parts of ourselves that are sort of like constantly hidden a little bit, or constantly being, you know, like uncovered later, or so I think I like that. I like that idea of I mean, conceptually, like blocking space, and then also like the way that vision sees through. You know, it's thinking about perspective and depth, and also barriers. You know, I mean, barriers play such a huge role in our lives. Like when you think about nation states and what they are, like what are they, right? Like what is this idea of being constrained or blocked, which is I think part of why I think the panels really work, because it doesn't sort of like presents that, but it doesn't actually close you in.
Beautiful, thank you. Does anyone else have a
Thank you for that question. Appreciate it.
No more questions?
Can I ask another one?
Sorry. Go for it.
Also, I was thinking about Claire's piece. I was kind of interested in how all the images are pixelated.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the question of what is legible and what is not legible anymore. Especially when you combine the modularity of the structure, everything becomes even less legible. So I wonder, how do you interpret, you know, how this information you have in your archive, which is really personal, get translated in this way?
I think that's something that I'm really dealing with right now. It's like I'm working with a public archive and a personal archive. And the public archive is usually what is printed on the straps. It's like these holders of information. But then the personal archive is like super abstracted. Like I know that when I present it, people aren't like, oh, that is that and that. It's like it becomes like almost a barrier in order to kind of understand the information. And I think I can spiral a little bit because of this, because it's like these images that are very personal. I know that they were taken not in order to be part of an artwork, they were taken for like personal, for like memory evidentiary reasons. So for me, it's like, how can I add this into the work where it's not completely recontextualizing it, but also in a way that kind of gives it a lot of, what's the word, like honoring it, but also how can I use it in a way to kind of subvert this public archive that I'm really interested in finding ways that my own narrative kind of contrasts or is in symbiosis with it. And I think because I'm working in this like modular way and this like installation way, I'm able to kind of collage these two things together in different ways and try and figure out what they mean or they don't mean, or how does it work or how it doesn't work. But the abstraction in itself is, yeah, it's work in progress.
MVP, Coco. Does anyone else?
She's a great audience.
Okay, that's it. Thank you so much for joining us.